Good evening. Welcome to this talk organised jointly by the International Association for the Study of Arabia, IASA, the British Yemeni Society, and the MBI Al Jaber Foundation. It's on the language and ecology in southern and eastern Arabia. And it's based on an edited volume with 23 contributors that takes a multidisciplinary view of the relationship between language and ecology, examining expressions of and threats and challenges to the language and ecology relationship. There are three speakers. Professor Janet Watson, holds the leadership chair for language at the University of Leeds, where she's also co-director of the Centre for Endangered Languages, Cultures and Ecosystems. She's a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the IASA Seminar Committee, and is well known for her work on modern South Arabian languages. Janet will be followed by Dr. Jack Wilson, a lecturer in English language at Salford University, with a special focus on linguistics, pragmatics and gesture studies. Dawn Chatty is another fellow of the British Academy and is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Forced Migration and former Director of the Refugee Centre at Oxford University. She has a particular knowledge of Oman. I see that Miranda Morris is one of several contributors who is with us this evening. They'll speak for about 45 minutes, after which there'll be a Q&A.
So thank you very much, Noel, for this for the invitation to speak to the British Yemeni Society. It's a great privilege to be able to do so. So we're going to talk. I'm going to give an introduction to the book and talk about a couple of areas which are mentioned, a couple of topics which are mentioned within the book, and then I'll hand over to Jack and then to Dawn. So I'm planning to talk for about 10 minutes, I hope. Jack, next slide, please. So Jack will be talking about language, gesture and ecology, and Dawn will be talking about people's non-participation in conservation, a case from Oman. Next slide, please. Thank you. And these are the people that we would like to acknowledge, and of course the British Academy for the invitation today. Next slide. Thank you. This is a list of the authors. I'm not going to go through them. I think it's about 23, but I haven't actually counted them for some time. Most of the chapters were co-authored, which was very nice, and often involved people from Oman or Yemen working with Western scholars. If we have the next slide. And so this is the area that we're talking about from, you probably can't see my cursor actually, but we're looking from Qatar, the coast of Oman, along here up into Yemen. If we go on to the next slide. Oh, thank you, Jack. We think one of the questions we asked was what these places have in common, given that Qatar is probably the richest state in terms of GDP, and Yemen is the poorest. And one of the things that they have in common is the fact that that all these areas have close association with the sea, and we've got the monsoon rain, so we've got the monsoon wind, so you can see the direction of the winter monsoon and the summer monsoon, which affects most of these areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the region that we're looking at is very linguistically diverse. We've got Qatari Arabic in Qatar, and then we've got the various languages spoken within Oman coming into Yemen and Socotra on the Socotra Peninsula. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So there are two areas where two topics. I think someone's not muted. Two topics which come up several times within the chapters. One is this idea of names before numbers, where names are an incredibly important aspect of the modern South Arabian languages that I've been working on, and in many of the Arabic dialects, where times of day are given by different terms depending on the position of the sun, depending on degree of shadow, degree of darkness, rather than numbers and hours. Periods of time are given not in terms of half an hour or 10 minutes, but the time it takes to walk from one wadi to another, or to cross a wadi, or to milk 10 camels. And dating takes place traditionally through climatic events. So I was born during the year of drowning, in Mehri, which we can point back to May 1959. And very often particular events will be situated in terms of the climatic event. If we go on to the next slide, we've got lots of nice wind there, and then with the cyclone. Next slide, please, Jack. Thank you. The language of wind. The language of wind comes up in several chapters of the terms that we use for different types of wind, metaphors and stories, wind within poetry, the huge complexity of the language of wind. This is a wind shelter. It's quite a modern wind shelter because it's got, rather than have thick stones at the bottom, it's got some cement. But it gives you some idea of the type of wind shelter that we have. We were counting recently and working with a Masters of Fine Arts student on a wind documentary around wind terms in Southern Arabia within Mehri, and we found 47 different terms for wind, each of which in the English translation requires either breeze or wind or gust. If we then look at the next section, this is just an example of some of the terms that you have for wind in Mehri, Hazais and Kolsum, Deet, Belit. So the terms differ depending on where the wind comes from, whether it's cold, whether it's dry. Classes have got a dry wind, what time it comes during the day, whether it comes in the early morning, as in Noho, or indeed Hazaimet, that comes in the early evening. The heat of the wind, Khurub Turab, a searing hot desert wind, Belich Mamiet, a cold, strong desert wind. The next slide, I was thinking of another one. No, this is fine. So this gives this part of the poem comes up in the chapter by Leib Herbert Al-Barami and Mashayikhi, where social and political commentary comes up in a scene based on the monsoonal rain clouds and seasonal wind. Could never love anything but the monsoon that brings the rain clouds and the breeze which pushes them up and over the high mountains. The next slide, I think, yes. This will link hopefully relatively seamlessly into Jack's talk. This is someone pointing to a rain cloud, and I want you to see what he does with in the way in which he points, and how it's described. It's interpreted by my friend Abdullah Al-Mahri, and this is Sahel. If you could play this, Jack.
دوم هاي صندوق
رقم طيرو
كنت مغطي كاروتاك ما بهيدك
لقيت إن كانوا بو
وهم مغطي
غلطات خارطة ركبوا الخطة
عادي بوندي او مين وطن
خير
يغير نفتين بديل
ما شاء الله ما شاء الله. محمد سناء
سناء مسحو رقم طيرو
قمطرو
قمطرو
قمطرو تصير قمطرو ترى قمطرو
قمطرو كنت
وبس حور
بس حور.
بس حوري طيب
thank you.
هم جاوبتي
So when Sahel points at the rain cloud, he points with a hooked finger. And Abdullah asks him, why are you pointing like that at the rain cloud? And he says, if I were to point like that with a straight finger, it would disappear. But it's wonderful the way in which he does it. He doesn't say it will disappear in words. He uses his arm. Could you just show that, Jack?
I can try.
Yeah, try, yeah.
لقيت إن كانوا بو
وهم غطك
لمحات خارطة ركبوا الخرطة
عادي.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So I will now hand over to Jack.
Okay, I'll just set up.
Yeah, thanks. I think I managed that within 9 minutes.
Well, I might need that 1 minute. So, okay, so I'll put my I'll put my camera on just because I have a habit of gesturing. Well, Janet, you can hear me and you can see me, I think. Or maybe you can't see me yet. Oh, Janet's turned off. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Janet. Thanks for having me here today. I think nobody's saying they can't hear me, so I assume you can. I always feel a bit of an imposter at these events because I'm not really an Arabist or a Semitic language expert. What I'm particularly interested in is gesture. And when I say that I'm interested in gesture, one of the things that people assume I'm going to talk about, and not that I don't talk about these, but I'm not going to talk about them today, are the kinds of conventionalized gesture like Janet's just shown, like the what we call the hooked pointing gesture, which is used to point at clouds. And maybe you might think of, in English, maybe the thumbs up gesture or the okay gesture. But actually, what I want to talk about today and what I spend more time researching, and in the chapter in the book that Janet, Andrea, Saeed and I have written, we spend more time talking about the relationship between the structure of language, I suppose you could say, and gesture. So rather than try and explain it in the abstract, I'll show you an example of what I mean. And I'm hoping that you can hear and see this as clearly as it is on my screen. So, I've gone back. So this is one of our Mehri speakers that we've interacted with who came to the lab in Leeds and performed in an experiment where the speakers were asked to describe, you can see it on the right of the screen, this sort of treasure map type map. And what the speaker is going to describe here is the route that you can see in the middle. So it goes up towards the broken gate. And I'll just play it and then you'll see what I'm interested in, or we're interested in. So in particular, I'm interested in, so it's glossed as go up, but he pronounces it, he describes it as, what's the baby, I go up, and you get both. I don't know if you're looking at me, but you can see it in the video, this hand movement that depicts the path that he's describing. You also get this elongation of the vowel in that adverb, and you also get the linguistic description that's describing what's happening. And the point is that all three of those elements, the language, the gesture, the acoustic profile of the utterance, are meaningful, and they're coming together to help the speaker sort of demonstrate the meaning that they're trying to communicate. And Janet and I, but the rest of the team, part of our sort of program is that by video recording and audio recording lots of conversational and interactional data, we'll develop a rich database of these kind of multimodal practices. And what I'm going to hopefully try and show you today is that we see the same practices repeated across speakers in speakers of modern South Arabian languages. Okay, so just as a kind of way of setting the groundwork, I wasn't sure exactly what kind of audience I would have, and one of the ways that I try and introduce our perspective is with this notion of what I'm calling naive linguistics. And the general idea is that it's a kind of analog, or it's similar to what some people call naive physics. So that if naive physics is the kind of view that your average person, a person without a scientific education, might think about the physical world around them, then naive linguistics is the view that most people without a linguistics or an education in languages might have about language. And I think a key aspect of what we might call like a naive linguistic perspective is this idea that languages, or language in the singular, transparently refer to the world. This idea that languages kind of exist as a structure that we can use to refer to the world, and there isn't really a relationship between the world and language. And I think a better way to think about language, and a richer way to think about language, is the idea that when we use language, what we're doing is we're linking one event, which we might call the speech event, to another event, which we might call the described event. And when you think about language from this perspective, that it's actually two events, and it's not that a speech event isn't physical, it exists in the world in the same way that the described event exists, or existed, or might exist in the world. You realize that there's loads of links between those two events, not just the linguistic ones, but there are gestural ones, acoustic ones, spatial ones, perhaps cultural ones, if you want to think of it that way. And what I want to try and show you in this talk is that we can see that language has an impact on the way we conceptualize events or described events, but equally the way we conceptualize described events can have an effect on language. And one of the things that me, Janet, and the rest of our team have observed is that there seems to be similarities across modern South Arabian languages in this sense. And just as a kind of way of explaining an aspect of what I'm going to assume, I kind of assume that gesture, so these kind of visual accompaniments to utterances, can enrich our understanding of conceptualization. There's some sort of link between the way that someone's thinking about something and the way that they gesture. Okay, so I'm going to do it in two halves. First half, language has an impact on the way that we conceptualize events. And I'm going to talk specifically about spatial descriptions in modern South Arabian languages, in particular, Mehri and Shehret. So one of the things in the chapter in the book that we point out is that this paradigm that I'm presenting here seems to be a good way to represent certain types of spatial description in both Shehri and Mehri, and it seems to they seem to parallel each other. So I'm not going to talk about all of this. I'll just talk about a few rows in the table. So if you look at the top row, we've got Shehret. If a speaker is describing a path that is going to the left or going to the right, but we'll just take the left, you might get an utterance that's something like Did Lidis Shemele, which means in the gloss, return to hand left. Now, the important thing here is that you would translate this into English, let's say, as return left, or even go left. You might translate it as, if you're not taking into account of the return aspect. If you compare that to down, and you get the same thing with up, you get, so with down, you get haritaga, which means go down, down. And the thing that I want to point out is that in the left description or the right description, there seems to be this obligatory component of to hand, whereas in up and down, you don't get that component of to hand. And what that means is that if you look in the far left column, so where you've got adid or harit, these are the verbs that are describing the motion. In the vertical description, the motion verb is contiguous with the adverb that's describing the direction, whereas when you've got horizontal left or right, you've got this lidesh in the middle there, which is being inserted in between the motion verb and the direction that's being traveled, if you want to think of it that way. And what I want to show you is that this has an effect on the way that people talk about space and gesture about space. So I'm just going to show you this video first, which was recorded in Oman by a native Omani speaker for us. And the speaker here is describing, I think they're describing the way to the shops, but I can't remember exactly where they're going, but it doesn't make too much of a difference where they're going. But I'll play it and then I'll talk through it.
سيول سيدة وانتو تكيس ملف حيدك سيمة كيس إشارات وتوهوك حيدك حيمة.
So the bit that I want to focus on is the first utterance of Suot Sida, where you get go straight. And what you'll notice, or I'll play it again, you get one movement that represents going and straight, but later where you get Tufuk Haidik Haimel, you actually don't get any movement in the gesture on Tufuk or cross. You only get it on to hand right. So I'll just play that again and just watch. You get the same thing with the second utterance as well.
سيول سيدة وانتو تكيس ملف حيدك سيمة كيس إشارات وتوهوك حيدك حيمة.
So what we're arguing here, or one of the points we're going to argue, is that it seems like this separation in language of motion and direction results in a separation in the conceptualization of the movement here. Just to give you another example of this, where you get go down without separation. This is in Shehret this time. So you get go down, and then you get this description of orientation of the path that you're going down to the beaches on your left hand. So I'll just play that again. But what you don't get is just a gesture on either go or down. You get it on both of them. So the argument is that when direction and motion come together contiguously, you get a single path. But when they are separated because of the nature of horizontal descriptions in Shehret and Mehri, you get two, where you get a gesture only on one of them. Just to give you some interesting examples that I think provide further emphasis for this, this speaker, when they want to use rightness as an adverb, so as a word that appears directly next to the verb to go, they code switch to Arabic. So I'll play this and then I'll show you the bit that I mean. And it's that trith imin. So imin is Arabic for right, but it can be right in Arabic can be realized as an adverb in the same way it can in English, without to hand. So if you look at the actual gesture that appears alongside trith imin, it appears as a single gesture. It's a bit hard to see that one because he also traces it on the thing where you lose the sight of his finger. But yeah, so what we're arguing with left and right is that there seems to be a syntactic requirement of inserting, you might say, to hand. And what this means is that the verbal component, or the verb in the sentence, which could be return or it could be go, and the horizontal directional component, which might be right or left, aren't contiguous. And this leads to a conceptual separation between motion and direction that you see in the gesture. What provides further evidence for this is this doesn't happen when you're describing vertical motion and direction. So what we are arguing is that this syntactic constraint appears to have an impact on the way speakers conceptualize events, with gestures either representing movement or direction, but not both in one gesture. And you don't find this same thing in descriptions of vertical movements. I didn't present it here, but you also don't find it in languages where you don't get that separation either, like English. So that is how the way that the structure of language can have an impact on the way that people conceptualize space. But equally, one of the things I argued at the start is the way that people conceptualize events has an impact on language. And what I'm going to talk about is some kind of new research that Janet and I have been doing on what we're calling acoustic aspects. We do talk a bit about this in the chapter. So this is more straightforward if you're not used to looking at gesture. So I'll just show you. Here's the speaker describing how they get to Janet's house, basically. And what I'm interested in here is the elongation of that vowel in tegom, which means to go. So you get tegom fenuk. Importantly here, you get a single path gesture if you're following this on go straight, but that's not what I'm talking about. So I'll just play it again. And what we argue is that elongation is about the length of time that movement, that going takes. You get a different type of what we're calling acoustic aspect in this utterance. So I'll just play it and then I'll describe it. Here, rather than elongating gom, you get gom, gom, gom. And this reduplication or repeating of the lexical item is related to the aspect of, well, we think the continuous or the repeated movement of walking, maybe. So we have two processes here. We've got elongation that seems to be related to the temporal aspect of the described event, and we've got repeated, which seems to be associated with the repeated aspect of an event. I'll miss this one because it's showing the same thing. Here we've got another speaker who is describing a different situation. In this situation, they're describing churning of milk to make cheese. So what we get is tenugus, 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 which is the repeated action of churning. And then you get this te, which is essentially linking this. This is like until. It's about the length of time it takes before it's ready. So you've got both processes. You've got the repetition or reduplication and the elongation. And just the last one, because this one's a bit different, you've got this elongation on the word green, which seems to be about the readiness of it or the intensity of the green colour. Okay, so just as a way to kind of summarize some of these elements on this, what we're arguing is that in the speech event, the length of utterance time or the length of the utterance can be adapted, and it can be adapted either through reduplication or through elongation. When we get a reduplicated element, it seems to link to a continuous repeated action like churning or the action of walking with two legs. When you get elongation, it seems to be associated with the intensity of some described property like green, or the duration of the event that's being described like tigom for a long journey. Okay, I think that's kind of, I don't really have a conclusion slide. If people have questions, I'd be really happy to answer them, but I think I'm over my time anyway. I don't know where Janet is, but
I'm here. Should we hand over to Dawn now?
yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Thanks very much, Jack.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm on, aren't I? Okay.
Yes, you are. I can hear you. Yes, Dawn.
Okay, lovely. I'll try and keep to 15 minutes, if at all possible. First, let me say I'm very pleased to be here and to have this opportunity to speak really on a much broader level. I want to really look at one particular modern South Arabian language speaking group. I'm going to say the most remote of the groups, the Harasis of the Jidid Harasis, who I first came to know 45 years ago, in 1978. And after a 4-year United Nations project, which I led to extend government services to this group, I've continued to stay in contact with them. I try to go out each year to spend a little bit of time to actually watch the way that they have managed their own engagement with the modern state of Oman. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time with a brief historical contextualization of the way in which these Arab tribal societies in the 20th and 21st century have been engaging with settled society. So I'll just say a few words about the Bedu-Hadar dichotomy. I'll talk about, for a few minutes, the pacification efforts of the colonial period between, really that started in earnest between 1920, but it carried on into the latter part of the 20th century and even to the beginning of the 21st century, and then look at the various ways in which the Harasis, but also other tribal groups in Southeast Arabia have kind of managed to deal with a very rapidly changing environment, including language heritage, but the way in which they've engaged with a form of economic transformation and integration into the regional economies, but have lacked a meaningful relationship with oil companies, who throughout the region are often seen as the government in the desert areas of Southeast Arabia, and then latterly with international conservation organizations such as the World Wildlife Foundation. So let me progress. Yes, so this whole region has been, I think, very much a part of the sort of Muslim history and historiography, which developed a kind of understanding of the dichotomy between those people who live in rural areas, or you could say in desert areas, and those who lived in urban areas. And this understanding of that kind of dichotomy has always been a very important part of the cultural and social dimensions of an understanding of human life in the region. So it was kind of the nomadic mobile divide became a very deeply ingrained idealization of social categories in the region. After the 1970s, what I tried to argue in some other papers is that the authentic inhabitants of these desert regions, and I use the term authentic so as, not to say indigenous or autochthonous even, but these inhabitants of the desert regions became regarded as outsiders, as development efforts in the region really took off, and there was a national sort of effort at hegemonic national identity to create a unified nation, but it was often at the expense of these Arab tribes in the interior deserts. So the example certainly in Oman is the way in which a national language, Arabic, came to represent the hegemonic ethnic group in power, the Ibadi of Oman, rather than the once preferred language, you could say the Swahili of many of the returning expatriate Omanis from Zanzibar and East Africa, and then the South Arabian languages in the interior, such as Harsusi, Mahri, Batahari, Jabali. This is not even to mention Baluchi and Urdu and other languages that are prevalent in the region. In particular, my interest in the Jid al-Harasis, this is an area that became what I'm going to call terra nullius for the oil company. In other words, people didn't matter. What they were really interested in was what was underneath the ground. And then also over time, it became what I'm going to call a tabula rasa for much of the protectionist conservationists who viewed the area as a perfect sanctuary for animal reintroductions, but didn't really think much about the people who lived in this area. You hardly need this map here because we've just seen some terrific maps from Jack and from Janet, but I put it up here basically because what I wanted to say is that the conflicts between tribes were really minimal, or they were managed through what I'm going to say social mechanisms to manage conflicts. But the conflicts that were not managed very well were actually conflicts with the conservation bodies and also with the extractive industry. So initially it was with the the oil company, but now it's with a number of other companies involved with the oil company, which extracted oil and gas from the region. And really until the Arab Spring in 2011 gave very little back to the people in the desert areas other than some road grading and some water distribution. Also, initially, the Sultan's Office of the Advisor for the Environment in the 1980s and 1990s also made for some difficulty in terms of access, claiming that, of course, that the oryx and the camel and goats of these tribal groups somehow competed, although there were no empirical studies to show this in particular. So I just say a little bit more. Let me see if I can move on about the Jeddah and its people. There are various estimates, but from my own sample in the 1980s, I talked about probably a community of about 5,000 people, although those numbers have now become much larger, moving over a vast waterless plain of about 42,000 square kilometers, so an area about the size of Scotland, or if you're in the United States, about the size of the state of Delaware. And this particular group, the Harasis, particularly interesting. I've always called it a refuge tribe. They are people largely of Dhofari origin, pushed into this most inhospitable core area of the central desert of Oman, the most remote, the most isolated. And in a way, I could say that they inhabited an area basically that separates northern Oman from Dhofar and is a backwater to both regions. And as such, it was a region that attracted individuals and groups who might have been expelled from their own tribe as a punishment for a major infraction or another infraction of various codes of conduct or honor. So it is a tribe that has lineages that have, some of them have much closer attachments to the Mahra, others to the Janaba, and so on. Just a little bit more about the Jeddah. So this is the area that you can see that is basically the core area of the Jeddah Harasis. Some of it is made up of sand dunes of the empty quarter that extend into the Jeddah, but most of it is a rock and gravel plain. Initially in the 1980s, there were only 3 water wells that had just been opened a couple of decades before at the insistence of the tribal leadership, and the oil company then did agree to open these wells. But as I said earlier, the oil companies still tended to regard this territory as terra nullius, didn't really recognize that people lived there. Most of the engineers, both Western engineers and local engineers, believed that these tribal groups rushed into the desert areas whenever exploration parties showed up in order to ask for water or fuel or leftover food for their animals. However, it's a thriving community that has used these areas. And this is just one image that I have, which is a reminder of the 2 seasons. You know, although it's an area that has very little rainfall, probably less than 50 millimeters a year, it does have 2 seasons, and these relate to the winter and summer monsoons, the image of which we saw a little bit earlier. Around March and September, this very heavy dew or occult precipitation gives a seasonal growth, particularly for trees like the Acacia tortilis or the umbrella thorn, and the Prosopis cinerea, or the Raf, as it's called locally. Just a few images of the big kind of transformations that have taken place in this area. These were a few of the images that I took in 1979. The Harasis, of course, were known trackers, and of course are one of the 6 modern South Arabian language speakers that are now being protected by the UNESCO Endangered Languages Program. By the 1980s, of course, change had begun. We had social housing that was developed by the government, even though for the first 2 decades, the Harasis didn't live in these social housings. They preferred to shelter their goats. in this housing, and then later on to rent out these units to the local employees of the oil company at Bahja. So the seasonal occupation of these houses followed the school cycle. And over time, by the 1990s, it was very clear that split households was very common, with largely female-headed households with goats camped near to the schools, with men engaged in much more distant full-time either employment or management of the camel herds, if they hadn't yet moved into hiring both Baluchi and Sindh herders to look after the herds while they took on jobs with the army or with security services. What I just want to get to, and this is the title of the paper, which I have included in the book. In the early 1980s, the World Wildlife Fund, through the help of the IUCN, decided to basically expropriate 25% of the Jidda for the reintroduction of the Arabian oryx, which had been hunted to extinction in the early 1970s. The Harasis were originally very happy to see this reintroduction, but things kind of changed rather dramatically when they realized that they were discouraged and sometimes prevented from actually camping in an area of this reserve, which was the north eastern quadrangle of the Jidda. However, initially about a dozen of the Harasis were hired as trackers for the scientific projects that were part of this project to understand the social behavior of the reintroduced oryx. So there was a recognition that it was the Harasis who had the knowledge of the landscape that was implicitly acknowledged by the IUCN in their reliance on Harasis as trackers, but that kind of knowledge would have needed to have been reconfirmed with each succeeding generation. And unfortunately, there wasn't really time for that to happen. Between 1982 and 1996, the original herd that was set up of about 48 oryx in 1982 had grown to about 400 in 1996. But because the youth weren't really involved in any of this project, and there were, of course, a number of other reasons, the illegal capture of female oryx became widespread. The younger generation of the Harasis knew this was happening, but could do very little about it. It was often members of other tribes that were after the very large purses that were being offered for live females. A lot of this was coming from the United Arab Emirates and from Saudi Arabia, so that by 1996, the army was called in to protect the remaining 122 oryx, and they were introduced to an extended enclosure. And this is what you're seeing here with the enclosure at the distance. It's about 25 square kilometers by 25 square kilometers. And so the special relationship of the Harasis with the oryx was then, I'm going to say, sort of undone. So just let me wrap up the points I wanted to make here very quickly. That basically the participation of local people in conservation really would have made a difference if it had been much more than just the passive participation, the tracking of a few of the men. That if had there been a sort of a more local autochthonous involvement of the Harasis with the oryx, and perhaps we may not have seen the collapse of this kind of a project, which incidentally meant that the UNESCO recognition of the Arabian Oryx Sanctuary was withdrawn in the early years of the 21st century. And the youth today have really very little attachment to the oryx because there was really no effort to bring them closer in. The other issues that have emerged, partially because of this really lack of interest, I'm going to say, in the Harasis in this most remote part of Oman, there's been really very little interest in helping the Harasis to maintain their language. They're themselves quite concerned because, of course, Arabic is the hegemonic language, and there is no way of continuing language except through what is taught at home. And the challenges to their identity remain with the view of the oil company as the desert being sort of empty of people, terra nullius. And then again, as I said earlier, there's this contestation that has existed with the animal reintroductions through what I'm going to call the fortress conservation. But what I'll very, very quickly end with a positive note in that over time, as the Harasis have developed what I'm going to call seasonal housing, either in Haima or along the borderland with the United Arab Emirates, they've maintained their camel herds in Oman, and they become very, very attached to what they call the azba or the azab. This is where they spend much of their time over weekends, over holidays, and they make sure that they bring their children out and teach them about life in the desert, talk Harsusi with their children, and accustom them to their goats, goat herds and camel herds. So this azba, which I think is a 19th century term meaning the place where the camels camp temporarily within a couple of days' distance of the main camp, has now become something more like what I'm going to call your orchard, your farm, your weekend retreat. And I think that is perhaps one of the positive signs that I see towards maintaining their language amongst the young and also maintaining their culture and their social organization. I'll stop here. I've gone a little bit over time, but not too much, I hope. So let me stop sharing and hand over to Noel.
Yes, I'll start my video. Yes, hello. Well, thank you very much. Terrific. For the Q&A, you're most welcome to put your camera on if you want to ask a question, and unmute yourself and ask it direct, or you can put the question in the chat button, and I'll pick it up for you. So please, can I open it up now for any questions to any of the speakers? Could I ask Dawn? I think it's Dawn. The UNESCO Endangered Languages program, how does it actually work? And does it include all the MSAL languages?
Well, I think you're asking the wrong person.
Oh, sorry.
I think Janet is the person to ask. I mean, I believe it includes all of the South Arabian modern languages. But Janet, you need to answer that.
Oh, right.
I'm really not sure. Miranda's here. Miranda, do you know?
As far as I know, it's all talk and no action.
Oh, all right.
Certainly the ones I know intimately, Bakari, Hobiot and Sharat, there's been no activity whatsoever. Yeah. So I doubt whether there's been any on Harsusi and Mehri. I think it has to be locally inspired, and it's just a cosmetic, I think. I'm sad to say.
Right. Sorry. Is it Gerard Lally? Do you want to ask a question?
No, I don't have a question at this time.
Oh, right, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I'm certainly if the cameras are on. No. Can't see them all at once. That's the trouble. Okay. I mean, Janet, is it possible also to say something a bit more broadly about the book? Because it covers such a range.
Yes.
I was reading it the last 2 or 3 days. It isn't just the Danish language. It's things like Hadrami Arabic and how that used I think largely in sailing or seafaring, and then the languages like Kumzari, which very little. I think very few people know about it.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the book it comes in 3 sections. We've got the significance of names and words, with a wonderful chapter by Miranda that I was rereading the other day, What's in the Name? And I mean, that chapter is just so rich, and it's looking at the importance of naming within a flora and fauna. When you use a name, when you don't use a name, names for time, the dating. Saeed Al-Qamari, I think you've got your. I think you need to mute yourself.
Saeed Al-Qamari, yes,
can you mute people?
Sorry, no, I think he.
Yeah, great, well
unmuted.
done. No, do it again. Yeah, you can mute him.
Mute him. Okay. Right.
Can you do that? Yeah, well done. Water and Culture Among the Modern South Arabian Speaking People by Gasparini and Said Al-Mahri, and the different terms that are used for different bodies of water and how water affects culture. A botanical and etymological approach to plant names in Southern Arabia with Shahina Ghazanfar and Leonard Kogan. Traditional knowledge and vocabulary around weather and astronomy in Qatar. And then part 2 looks at narratives and ecology, and how language and nature come up time and time again within folklore, within poetry. And then, yes, Saad Al-Manji and I have a chapter on climatic disasters and stories of resilience in northern and southern Oman. And Dawn's lovely chapter, which he spoke about now, on people's non-participation in conservation. So we cover a huge, like the edges of a huge area, that area that borders the sea. Yeah.
There's that. I have a question here. I think a question for our colleague Dawn Chatty. Did you notice any words disappearing from people's vocabulary as a result of further distancing from ecological surroundings, and in particular as a result of the loss of direct contact with some animal species, such as the example you mentioned, the example you raised in your presentation?
Okay, I'm going to have to be absolutely honest here. I speak Arabic, but I only ever learned how to say yes and no thank you and to count to 10 in Harsusi. So I wouldn't be able to actually answer that. What I did notice was the inclusion of so many words from English. You know, so for example, the car key to turn on the car was called a sweek, or sweekat, from a switch, they talked about baramil, as the barrels that the oil company left behind, or jembing, the kind of sort of rough ride over the doors. But I wouldn't be able to say what words might have disappeared from Harsusi, because I just never learned to master it. Miranda might be able to tell us that, because I think she you did spend some time in working with the Harsis yourself, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And the terms that I noticed to disappear among the young, I stayed with a young woman when she was just married, and she's now an elderly lady like me. And her children and her grandchildren know hardly any of the names of the plants, and very few names of desert fauna. Mm. So they've lost, they don't need it. I mean, it's understandable. Language is always changing. And so they don't need it. And schools don't seem to encourage any enthusiasm about your own area, the own area you live in. And when I used to give talks in schools in Arabic to schools in Oman, trying to encourage people to pay attention to their former languages, the same question always came up. The Quran is written in Arabic. Arabic is the language of God, and why would we want to speak any of these languages? And although I would try to counter this by saying, obviously, since God created everything, he created these languages, so they're not unimportant, it was always met with not very much enthusiasm. And to my interest, even in the whole of Dhofar, I only met one person who'd heard of Harsusi, and none had heard of Bathari. So it's very regional. You're very aware of your own language, but you don't see the importance of pursuing it.
Yeah, if I can just add, I guess about 5 years ago, I made some films, some video clips of interviews with a couple of the elders amongst the Harasis. And at one point, I asked two sons to talk with their father in Harsusi. And I'll put up the website in a minute if you want to hear it. All I can say is that I expected not to understand anything, but actually I understood about 50% of what they were talking about, which said to me that even the young were using a lot of Arabic as they were supposedly talking Harsusi with their father, which again goes along with the kind of loss of language of the language amongst the young.
Thank you very much.
I'll just put that up here.
And also, I think Dawn would say to everyone to hear two youth talking in Harsusi, but using a lot of Arabic.
I had a question for Jack, if I may.
Please. Site www.nomadsinOman.com.
Yeah,
that's also in the chat.
I was interested in your up and down and right and left. Did you have any cardinal points?
The diversity of
north, south, east, west?
That was addressed to.
We haven't. I think we have
the diversity of gesture
data to do
as
with
wide as
cardinal
the
points.
diversity of spoken language.
But because
did you cover that?
We
Jack?
started with that kind of
you referred to it,
lab-based map task.
Ingrid seems to be.
We didn't get any cardinal directions anyway. In sort of, so they didn't talk about the map as if there's a north, south, east, west. They always talked about it in terms of left and right. But I think in some ways the study kind of promotes that way of speaking. When I first started looking at modern South Arabian and spatial descriptions, I had this kind of assumption. I don't know if people are familiar with this, the idea of like the difference between egocentric and geocentric frame of reference. So languages that sort of seem to obligatorily encode geographical features in terms of space. So even if you're inside your own house, you talk about, the knife being towards the mountains or rather than on the left hand or whatever. And I had this suspicion that perhaps that could be in the past of modern South Arabian languages. They might have been more geocentric and they've become more egocentric, perhaps as the result, as a kind of the impact of standard Arabic with left and right turn. But we don't have, Janet might have more information on that, but we don't have evidence of that. But I think one of the things we talk about in the chapter is different types of wayfinding descriptions. So if people are talking about a region, they tend to point with a splayed hand versus a route description. Usually you get like a tracing point with two fingers, and then a specific location, you get a single finger. But I think because we're always sort of clutching at the bits of video data that we get, I'm always apprehensive to make too much of a generalization on a small amount of data and I think that's the future of it, getting more data.
I was interested because among the Batahra, who are a very impoverished group who live on a stretch of very dry sand opposite the Al-Halaniyat Islands, they absolutely know where east is because the sun rises and prayer and so on. But the terms Sharqi and Gharbi, which should mean east and west, Sharqi means going out to sea, which is not east, and Gharbi means going inland. And if you ask similar questions of many of the modern South Arabian languages, it seems that they know the cardinal points that we think are cardinal points, north, east, south, west, but they don't always use them to mean that. It might be an interesting thing to look into. Anyway, I'll stop. I'm taking up too much time.
But just on that, one of the things we do talk about in the chapter, and we've recognised, is when people talk about times of the day, they talk about them in terms of the location that the sun would be if you were looking. and they tend to point to the different locations, but they are accurate in terms of east and west, in terms of the direction they're pointing, even when they're in a house, rather than, like, even if they can't see the sun, they use the cardinal points. Is it okay? Sorry, go on, Janet.
Sorry, could I just jump in there? Because I've got some nice wind video data that I need to share with you, Jack, that I did last time, where I've got a young man in Rabkut in a tent referring to the direction, referring to the wind coming, the Bilit wind coming from the Negt, coming from downstream, and the indeed the sea wind coming from upstream, and he's absolutely accurate.
Yeah,
he's gesturing.
Yeah, just there was a couple of questions about I guess like their gesture diversity, and is it okay if I answer them just while, I don't know if no one said okay. So I think one of the things that we talk about in the chapter is that we often think about diversity in language as if it's on two dimensions. So you've got region, if you want to think of it that way, geographical location and language. So you can say, okay, so this region is Mehri speaking and this region is another language speaking or whatever. But the second you start adding different forms of semiotic practices, you might think of it, but like aspects of material production, it could be like, do people make water skins, or do they make certain types of milk bowls, or whatever it happens to be? Or you're talking about pointing gestures, or you're talking about particular syntactic constructions. You find that don't sit neatly on top of each other. So you can just kind of like, this is a community and they all have this semiotic practice and they all have this linguistic practice and they all have this form of material production or whatever. But what you find is like they sort of overlap in a kind of kaleidoscope where you can see some things that are general to multiple MSL, and you can see some things that are specific to a individual group, and that could be gesture, but it could equally be a linguistic practice. And just one thing that we've started to notice, and we need more data on this, is people who live, I think I'm right in saying this, Janet might be able to correct me, in mountainous regions, there seems to be a group of people who point with the lips, which is it happens around the world, where lip pointing is the kind of standard form of just like this, or sometimes with the tongue. I think Janet's seen it. And we don't find that in any of our Mehri speakers, lip pointing, and it seems to only be in specific groups. So I don't know if there is a sort of a distinction perhaps in people who live more in the mountains versus in the plains or towards the ocean or whatever, and there's a difference in pointing that way. But just to answer the question of diversity, you do get gesture diversity, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it kind of directly parallels or it is as diverse as language, because they seem to interact with each other in all sorts of ways.
There's from Paul Hugh Smith comment is really asking about what has the impact been of the mobile phone on gesture?
I mean, Janet, I think you could answer this, but we were actually talking about this the other day. So we were talking about elongation and reduplication. The text medium is it's really easy to elongate. You could have to go, but with the letter repeated again and again and again. And I think Janet has it with wean, which means small. I think is that. I think you muted.
Sorry.
Janet.
No, it means very. It means
very. Yeah,
Yeah.
wean, very.
Yeah. So, Paul, I'm not sure whether you mean speaking on the mobile phone or writing on the mobile phone.
Well, actually, I meant speaking, but now you've introduced texting as well. That introduces a whole different idea, which I hadn't thought of. Yes.
Yeah. Because certainly in writing, elongation is done by repetition of the letter a lot. I mean, one of the things that we found about telephone conversations is that people, even if they're on the phone, they will still use gesture. They obviously won't use a two-handed gesture unless they've got the phone on the table, but they will still use gesture even though no one can see it. And you could probably test yourself by holding your phone and sitting on your other hand and seeing whether you can still speak as fluently. You probably can't.
Well, thank you very much, Janet, Dawn, Jack, and Miranda, and others who contributed this evening. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Just to remind you, it was organized today by the International Association for the Study of Arabia, the British Yemeni Society, and the MBI Al Jaber Foundation. That's all three organizations that will welcome you to see future lectures in this series. Thank you very much.